Glenn Carle is an American writer and former intelligence officer. He's the author of The Interrogator, An Education 2011, which describes his involvement in the interrogation of a man at the time believed to be one of the top members of al-Qaeda. Glenn spent 20 years in clandestine field operations with the Central Intelligence Agency. Glenn retired as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats and the National Intelligence Council. He has been highly critical of President Donald Trump, and many of you will know that if you've seen our first interview, which did spectacularly well as we explored some of the nuances of that topic. That was around July this year. And he particularly started to look at the Trump phenomenon after Trump started to disparage the American intelligence agency's assessments of Russian influence over the 2016 presidential election. And we're going to be touching, obviously, upon that issue of governance and intelligence in Trump 2.0. Glenn is a columnist for Newsweek Japan, providing commentary and analysis on international relations, geostrategic and US political issues, and foreign policy and intelligence. Before we jump in, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee. It is through your generous assistance that we can continue to make and share these materials on YouTube. Glenn, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, let's start.
I want to jump in here and
Yep.
correct you on something. Actually, I'm being serious, although not at the shouting level of correction. It's a chronological issue, but maybe of some substance. I actually didn't start focusing on Trump and Russia and the connections of the two after the reports of the Russian disinformation, intelligence, and approach about the American election and Trump campaign had become publicly in the public domain, but at least a year prior to that, and I cannot prove this, but I think I was the first person to say in public to raise concerns about the associations of Russian intelligence with the Trump campaign, Trump enterprise, and Trump himself. But that was myself. Just note as a professional intelligence officer, things just jumped out. And I became progressively alarmed, even nearly frantic about the significance of this and the desire that American authorities be aware and focused on this. And I couldn't imagine that I, sitting alone as a retired officer, would be the only one who would notice this, and I'm sure I wasn't. But it was well more than a year prior to things becoming public that I was alarmed.
Absolutely, I think. But it's because I'm guessing you are familiar with active measures, the mechanics of Russian, not just disinformation propaganda, but the more aggressive attempts to hack the intelligence services. People like John Cipher, who I've spoken to, of course, would notice this as well. But it's only because you're living and breathing and studying these methodologies over a few decades. So, is there a sort of institutional failing here that people during the Cold War, we simply, let go of the talent or stopped investing or providing time for people to study and understand these aggressive processes of Russian intelligence?
I don't think that's the case. I think it's um, a disharmony or a incomprehension of the lay person and the public and even officials uh, on one side with, on the other, professional intelligence officers. And I have something I've said in many interviews, and to always the same reaction, which is sort of no reaction, which is that it's shocking. People would be flabbergasted. The average person would be and should be flabbergasted if they were aware of the pervasiveness of the influence of intelligence agencies on what we believe is happening as citizens or observers of public affairs, and what is happening. And that include there almost any intelligence service is in some way active, but the big ones, of course, are the ones playing the real role. And there's almost nothing that happens in the news that has not in some way been touched upon by, is being acted upon by, or has been shaped by an intelligence service. It really is stunning. Now, the immediate response, and it's an obvious one to make. I'm aware of the vulnerability of opening from making such an assertion, is that, well, that sounds just insanely paranoid, and you're hyper over focused, obsessed with what you spent your time doing, and that's simply not possible at all. Um, would that it were so, but it really is shocking how powerful the and pervasive intelligence operations are. So that Russia would be doing this is not surprising. They have acted upon every other society from the get-go, from 1917, when they took over from what the Tsar was doing. But the current professionalism and success, and the strategies and the techniques they're using, because the world is a different technological and social place now, are more powerful, more effective.
And of course, it's not surprising in that sense that, I mean, it's not to say that every event is orchestrated by intelligence services, but let's say take Maidan and the revolution that happened in Ukraine. Of course, on some level, it's aligned with Western policy or maybe desire to see, Russian influence either fail or be pushed out. That then gets conflated with perhaps an overactive sense of how either pervasive or effective an intelligence service could be at the organizational detail of such an extraordinary event as Maidan. And we know there are many forces at play which are just impossible, for any government to directly influence. But it's not surprising, perhaps, in that sense, that the Russian state, who perhaps believes in the all-pervasive nature of intelligence services, because essentially, Russia is a society where the intelligence service has a country rather than the other way around, as it's being compared. It's
That's right.
perhaps not surprising they'd see Maidan as entirely artificial, that they'd fail to understand that you can actually have organic politics that is effective at that scale, and they're more inclined to the more, paranoid view that it's, say, a CIA coup.
Oh, it's all true, and there are a couple of dynamics happening. One psychological, the social psychological, and the other cultural, which overlap from when you look at what Russians believed, Russian officials believed, and then did in Ukraine. But this is just a good example. It's the truth pretty much everywhere, but every country. Uh, Two things come to mind to help frame it. The Operation Ryan, few people have ever heard of. That was a KGB operation in the 1980s, early in my career. And actually, my career had nothing to do with it, except that chronologically, my career coincided. I began my career when Reagan was president, his first term. So the Russians listened to Reagan, denounce them as an evil empire, and then talk about tearing down walls and building up defense spending, and significantly increasing what already had been an impressively increasing amount of aid by the United States to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the purpose being to kill as many Russians as possible for as long as possible, um, with great success, actually. And they thought, well, this is really a huge threat, and he's going to launch a first strike and kill us all to eliminate his enemy. And so the orders went out from the Kremlin, from the KGB, to all their residencies, all of their stations around the world, to report on anything that they could obtain to learn about American intentions to launch a first strike. Well, that's a legitimate and a responsible thing to do. You want to know if an enemy is going to attack you. And it's one of the first things I worked on when I was in training, actually. You don't want to be surprised. That's the point of intelligence service. So that is fine. But the way it was framed by the KGB was this is going to happen. Report, look carefully for any sign that it will happen. It wasn't what is happening and report what you learn is happening. It was this is what's going to happen. Please beware and look for it. So it was totally screwed up from the beginning. Uh, and you'd think that an equivalent to me off in the field would go, oh my God, these people are just lunatics. They've given the answer before they've asked the question. And that would be an insane thing for the United States to do. There's no way, you can just tell the Americans are going to launch a first strike. But no, you can't do that, because if you say that, you are then challenging orthodoxy, you're challenging your orders, and you're challenging the truth, and you will be destroyed. So the two things then happened. And the KGB officers who were perhaps aware that it was cockamamie and surreal, nonetheless had to play within this Kafkaesque system. And so, with confirmation bias, they said, well, suspect CIA officer Glenn Carle bought a Russian novel. Or, who knows, something. And he's never shown interest in Russia before. Therefore, even non-specialist American intelligence officers are now turning their attention to long-term planning for the invasion. I mean, what? But but that sort of thing happened more insidiously. But at the same time, people believe the framework of beliefs and perceptions, the paradigm of what is acceptable within their own tribe. Most people do. We all are on a bell curve and the standard deviation. And so lunacy might be here, but if your bell curve is over this way because the a prioris are all frightening, terrifying, then people actually believe it. And I saw this. Well, we all have lived this every day of our lives, but I saw this firsthand, horrifyingly, when the instruction came to my colleagues, who are almost not without exception, but are principled, honorable, talented, trained professionals who, in an institution that is designed to doubt our information and to check our conclusions, never to accept anything. Nonetheless, as soon as the instruction came, is that the White House said we are to do the following, which was to torture, people saluted and said, oh, well, it's okay. By definition, we're the good guys, and we've been told that it's okay, so therefore it has to be okay. And they were sincere in this. So in the Russian side, the order came, the Americans are planning a first strike, we're afraid, so find evidence. So reports started to go in to the Kremlin, saying, substantiating the American plan. And so the Soviet leadership became terrified that this was going to happen. They confirmed their fears. The second framework that is important to know with regard to Maidan and the Ukraine events as perceived by Vladimir Putin and the Russians, but in particular, Putin in particular, is that they're frames of what is acceptable and natural, just as you touched upon in your question, are different. And so Putin, I am convinced, sincerely believes that Hillary Clinton tried to overthrow him by using the CIA in a covert operation. Why? Because the Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America and you'll know them better than I, the various NGOs went to Russia and from the United Nations and the European Union to promote a free and fair election, which by definition, he said, well, you're out to get me. Well, probably he would have lost a free and fair election, Vladimir Putin. So therefore, what you're doing is hostile to me and is intentional. Well, we might have wanted to get rid of Putin, but our objective was to promote democracy. It's not the same thing. As far as he's concerned, it is. And so he is convinced that the United States sought to overthrow him. And then, as you will know better than I, at the same time, you have these two dynamics of um, perceiving Western actions from a zero-sum perspective, which is divorced from reality, Putin, and two, from the affirmation bias, confirmation bias, and framing of hostile intent from the outset by the KGB and Russian culture. uh, the KGB gets the answer that it wants, that what is happening in Ukraine clearly is part of this large plot. Now, the other thing they I think quite accurately and consciously have perceived, certainly this is to me the driver of, well, pretty much everything that's happened in Ukraine for decades, but certainly in the last 15 years or 2025, so maybe 20 years, 25, is that Ukraine has culturally shifted. It's civilizationally shifted, and polling shows this quite clearly. And so does economic. So does all the data you can consult. The trade levels have shifted towards the West. Um, the study of English has increased. The appeal of Greater Russia has declined. Even, as I understand it, you'll probably know better than I, and correct me if I'm wrong, even among Russian Ukrainians, that had was the truth prior to the war. And the shift to the west of Ukraine was patent, the desire of Ukrainians. Thus, the revolutions, the color revolutions, because they say, well, we want to be part of Europe, which means the EU and so on, rather than a subjugated, de facto subjugated little brother or tool of the Russian Imperium. And Putin is a great power, uh, Machiavellian, found that unacceptable, because that would perpetually, forever end what had been hundreds of years of Russian imperium. So that's how Putin sees what is this cultural shift as no, um, a CIA plot, one, and two. Even if it is a cultural shift, I don't accept it because it harms Russia. And there, like he's a realist power guy and doesn't care about the will of anybody other than what serves his definition of Moscow. Moscow's power. And so that's how they can see it as a nefarious action by my successors.
And of course, we like to think of him as being irrationally paranoid, but actually, because he was embedded in Sobchak's office, he would have seen the mechanics of politics at a sort of national and a local level happening, as well as the deep corruption. He would have seen, say, in 1996, that Western political technocrats or Western support, spin doctors, technology as they call it, were bussed in en masse to try and reverse what was expected to be a defeat of Boris Yeltsin in 1996. We forget about that. So he already has evidence that Western political technology and artifice is very capable and very effective. He's got the evidence there, and he's got the evidence of our, dare I say it, sort of lack of balance and unanimity. We're quite prepared to weigh in behind the guy that we want to win. What very few people, even Russian commentators, are aware of is that in 1997, when I was in St. Petersburg, they started harassing institutions, NGOs such as the British Council, trailing their workers,
Mm.
trying to shut down their activities. And I think this is directly linked. We helped to get Yeltsin elected. They saw the power of the Western non-governmental sector, which nonetheless can be aligned with, let's say, institutional governmental goals. And I think they became afraid and decided at that point, well before Putin got near the reins of power, to start dialing down the influence. That there's an interesting backstory here that we kind of conveniently forget. Evidence that we have given to Putin that actually our motives are base, our motives are entirely partisan, and that there's no such thing as organic politics.
I also think in my experience, I don't know that I've met a Russian official, which is this is certainly was surprising to me, which I'll explain. Met or worked with a Russian official who um, accepted that the United States, in particular, or anyone from the West, from any other country, could act in any benign, uh, mutually beneficial, or altruistic way whatsoever. That all of the talk about ideals and norms, rule of law, free and fair elections, market reform, currency reform, all of these things are are literally parts of a strategic uh, program to destroy Russia and eliminate any sort of rival that the United States would have. Jeffrey Sachs, the economist who either went or was sent early in the Clinton years to discuss market reform. Um, I think most people who have studied economics think that his advice was catastrophic. Catastrophic. Um, it was a testament, it was a monument to his ego rather than to anybody's insight, and certainly not his on how to reform market. Um, he doesn't think so to this day, of course, but uh, the Russians I dealt with would not accept that the intention in his going by the government of the United States was actually to do something right, and that everything was completely wrong from the American perspective, uh, and the objectives that the U.S. government was seeking to attain. But they don't accept that whatsoever. That's just like us saying, well, we're protecting choose the next colonial state from chaos, when they would say, well, no, you just want to continue to be able to buy, extract the resources or whatever. They just do not accept it. And my surprise was when the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall fell, and I started to meet, as many American officials did, regularly to work with our Russian counterparts. They I thought, okay, the bear is no longer pushing everybody down, and we can now have rational discussions and move ahead. And what I proved the stereotype of the American being a completely naive child, because that's not at all how just about any Russian I met was. The bureaucracies and the foreign ministry and the intelligence services were then, and quite clearly still are, utterly unreconstructed, completely unreconstructed. They are as defensive, aggressive, zero sum oriented, hostile to the Western norms. They remain Russians, where the sophisticated West is a lure, and and is the serpent's poison. It's just unchanged, and I think that continues to drive much of what's happening in Ukraine and towards Donald Trump, the election, and Russian policy.
And I think some people say, well, hang on a second, we're putting moral values on here, and I'm not comfortable with this. But actually, I think, we touched upon this in our last conversation. It talks something far deeper, which we need to look at as the kind of framework of a business model, not a moral framework necessarily, but it comes to zero sum. I think is a great way to look at it. Also, the idea that there's no such thing as a win-win scenario. You only have win-lose, and if the other side's won, then you've lost. I think there's that simple dynamic, but
Mm-hmm.
also it comes from a pre-industrial mindset, which I think was far more
Mm-hmm.
pervasive before the Industrial Revolution.
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
Industrial Revolution limits it, it breaks that limitation on land equaling wealth, on resource equaling wealth, because you can add value to resource, you can compound wealth through invention, innovation, cooperation, all these kind of things. And it breaks that idea of scarcity. Even dare I say, sort of famine and being on the edge of the risk of existence. Russia seems to me to have retained very much a pre-industrial mindset, which then informs their entire geopolitical outlook. The
It's
challenge,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
The challenge is that that is now being exported back into post-industrial Western societies. A big question there, but take it in chunks.
Well, it's something I've thought about. It's as much, well, gosh, for 40 years, actually. I started to become aware of the dynamic, the dangers, the processes that you were touching upon early in my career. Yeah, try to give a concise answer. So early in my career, one of my assignments, one of the parts of my portfolio, we'll call it, the issues I was supposed to uh, follow in my at that time was the far right in Europe. This is long before the fall of the Berlin Wall, so it's during the height or depths, however you want to describe it, of the Cold War. So I had to follow the far right. So okay, fine, fascinating. Uh, and I met with various far right activists and politicians in Europe. And one of them introduced me to, and he was a very intellectual fellow. He said, "Well, you know, this is all coherent. We aren't. We're trying to make a better society, and there's a philosophically woven whole that we're trying to pursue. And you must read René Guénon. I'll show you. Well, no matter. I can pull the book down if you want, but listeners can't see the book. René Guénon, Guenon, was a philosopher from the early 20th century. He's Frenchman. And he's one of the fathers of a movement that is very little heard of or known. But I believe, arguably, the central driving cultural force in Western history of the past 125 years that goes a long way to explaining the rise of fascism and populism and hostility to the West by the East and hostility of, we'll call it radical Islam, to the West and colonialism. Uh, and it's called traditionalism. René Guénon said essentially, well, the modern world, and this will be familiar to many people, the modern world alienates the individual. René Descartes said this in the 17th century. He said, "There's no place on earth more lonely than a city because every man is alone and anonymous." That's a paraphrase, but Descartes said that. I read this when I was a grad student or a college student. I can't find the quote in Descartes any longer, but I know that he did say this. In any event, others have said it. So modernism, the modernization of the world, industrialization, the age of reason, the secularization of societies, alienate the individual from his organic self and his purpose here on earth, which has to be harmony with the world around him and focus on inner contentment as opposed to material gain. A lot of people identify with much of that. Who doesn't, actually? And so it became a hostile. His view was that uh, we're turning into all civilizations and every individual into a nihilist, and we're committing suicide, even if we are still alive, through modernization. So we must reject this now by returning to traditional norms, which is, in the Russian context, the Orthodox Church, and there's no separation of the individual with the group, with the higher system of beliefs that don't just define but regulate all one's existence and of one's relation to the state and to any modern world. So change, progress, individual reason, secularism, all of these things are part of the devil's work, truly. This appeals to a lot of people who has not felt alienated, particularly as one gets older, by the rapidity of social change and the arc of personal life. So Guénon talked about this, and that explained this politician I was talking to, why he was supporting the far right, which wanted to eliminate the foreigner and the immigrant as culturally polluting and destructive, eliminate the secular humanists as part of the Antichrist in some ways, they believe literally, but certainly as subversive and dangerous to a, um, a successful, happy life. And that drove their politics. So I thought, well, that's interesting, but that's pretty abstruse and strange. And that was 40 years ago. And so, okay. However, then a decade later, I my it was in different assignments, and I started to work on terrorist related issues. And I wasn't a Middle Eastern specialist. I'm a European specialist. That's what my degrees are in European studies and economics, and I lived and studied in Europe and so on. That's the focus of my life. But everyone in the CIA turned to terrorism, unsurprisingly, after 9/11, and I did several years before. So I started to meet with terrorists, not just to interrogate them, but as my work to try to identify them, understand them, and find their causes and so on. And it turns out, shockingly at the time to me, that there are explicit connections between the driving individuals of what has become a thumbnail term characterized as radical Islam from the 19 from the colonial period up through the early 70s, with the major traditionalist thinkers at the time who had become Italians. Then they were the fathers of Mussolini's fascism and then of German fascism and Nazism, because it's a rejection of colonialism, which means the West, of secularism, which means the West, of the West because it is not the East or the Orient. And they were intellectually not just in tune, but they actually knew each other. And I think now my memory is failing me a little bit, but some prominent, to the extent they are prominent, thinkers in traditionalist thought, including Guénon, this is 110 years ago or 100 years ago, converted to Islam because it's more organically holistic, cogent view about how to interpret man's place in the universe. You don't have to deal with the complexity of a trinity and the intermediary of an ecclesiastic hierarchy, blah, 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 blah. So not just the affinities, but the explicit links are quite close. Similarly, this is true with Russian Orthodoxy, which has basically defined itself as a way for Russians to survive the hordes from the East and the insidious poisonings from the West.
And the brutality
So
of
it all
climate, dare I
fits.
say, as well. Climate and geography.
Sorry.
Climate and geography places more duress as well, which might explain why you go for something a little more. I wouldn't call it cohesive, but you know what I mean. Going for a philosophy that allows you to endure difficult location.
Well, it's also pre-modern because only the western end of Europe, this little end of the Eurasian landmass, ever has experienced organically the, call it 500 years, but maybe 700 years of the Renaissance, Reformation, Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment, and so on. All of those perspectives, beliefs, logical progressions are imports to Moscow or to Cairo. They're not organically emergent from the culture's own evolution. Uh, Whereas, the French killed themselves by, a third of the population, the Germans, a third of the population, the British for 100 years. We were all massacring one another over these questions in simply put, our religious wars, which were a response to changes coming from the Renaissance and then the Reformation. So it's an import, as my KGB friends always have said, and as I just described it in the Ukrainian context, rather than an organic one. But this traditionalist movement is a coherent, real phenomenon with a corpus of work and reference points that people try to follow, even when the politicians, and many of them are Americans now, um, have no idea whatsoever what I would be talking I'm talking about, or about the word itself, traditionalist.
That's it, and it's just an interesting perspective that makes people sort of scratch their heads actually, because I don't think they kind of. This is a question I think that gets people scratching their heads because this idea of an import, an external import of ideas that can become very important, structurally in society. If we look at Russia, Western literature, culture, etc., is an import, and all the modes of painting and writing that we now call Great Russian literature. As you say, it's not an indigenous format. You might have indigenous artists who take on that format and produce great stuff with it, but the format itself has not emerged in the area. But as we fast forward, we can look at communism, and this thought struck me. You had communism where the wealth of an entire country is essentially being marshaled so that a small number of people could live a almost bourgeois existence in terms of the quality of life. Then you
Mhm.
have the late 20th century, where you have this oligarchic structure and the import of consumerism. But again, it's so that a tiny number of individuals could ape a highly luxurious lifestyle, which is copied from the way certain people live in the West. But even industrialization, people will balk at this idea, but Russia in industrialization wasn't indigenous to it. It was imposed upon it. So I would argue that Russia never went through what we would call the Industrial Revolution because it never internalized the processes or even the logic of why you would actually have that.
Absolutely. Oh,
Always subordinated
that's
to
absolutely
power.
true.
Yeah.
Absolutely true. It was imposed from on high, which then did alter the culture some, but nonetheless it was a top-down phenomenon rather than an organic one. I would describe the same point, I think, just from a slightly different thing as you were talking about a moment ago. I think you mentioned literature. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, I thought, okay, I need to educate myself a little bit on the culture here. So I decided finally to read Gogol, and I read Taras Bulba. And I'd all my life heard about what a magnificent writer Gogol is, and I understand that Taras Bulba is not representative of his most subtle work. Okay, fine. Nonetheless, um, the contrast to me just jumped out, and I think is valid, between the world as one sees it through reading Taras Bulba and Gogol, or Dostoevsky, or Tolstoy even, compared to that of Herman Melville and Moby Dick, or Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn, for example. What do Twain and Melville um, say? How do they see the world? It's well, Huckleberry Finn really is a story of one hopes moral aspiration, if not redemption. The only pure soul on the entire story is the slave Jim. He's the hero of the tale, although he remains a slave and terribly treated. But the point that I'm raising is not that. It's rather that it's of an individual acting upon society, his responsibility. How does he find agency in his society? And Herman Melville is basically Melville himself in characterized Moby Dick as an overlong sermon. And I'm from New England, and Melville was from New England, and boy oh boy, this is the Calvinist Puritan ethic for 700 pages, where you are responsible for your fate, um, even though you're doomed. You nonetheless, it's the man alone against the universe, responsible for finding a way. That is the job. It is the individual is the center of the whole framework, the whole perception, the whole paradigm of life. Taras Bulba is one nationalist, almost screed is a little unfair to say. But the whole point of view of Taras Bulba is to exalt the supremacy and the martial ardor and the imperialist drive and obligation of, you can argue, Ukrainian, Russian, of the Slav against themselves and against the other. And then Dostoevsky is struggling massively, hugely influenced me, and I admire him a lot. The individual wrestling with fate, but it's a helpless individual who is dealing with a Kafkaesque state that no one can do anything about. And so your freedom is only to deny and to avoid, rather than to become part of and to transform in any sort of um, Whiggish arc of progress. It's an utterly different way of placing the individual in society. And I don't think it's changed an iota in 150 years.
And then the harmony is achieved when the individual decides to stop struggling, to stop that fight, and integrates back into, dare I say it, the collective. I mean, that seems to be the arc in many of those, which is, just give up, trying to wrestle with those modes of sort of Western philosophical, whatever it is, dialectical debate, and just let yourself be reabsorbed back into more
Because all of
traditional.
that is vain. The individual is vain to pretend, to purport to have anything to say or any agency whatsoever. You have to be part of the collective. So that's the only truth, is the collective, which I find horrifying. And whether it's right or wrong, it's utterly anti-Western. Or shifting the perspective, it's the West is utterly alien, at least to this perspective. At least for 500 years, it has been.
And let's turn to current events, because it seems to me that in this age of extraordinary plenty, but where people are disconnected from, the modes of production and indeed the sort of culture that gave rise to various forces in liberal democracy as well as industrialization, we seem to be lapsing back into the mindset of scarcity, which breeds a politics of resentment, a politics of retribution, and all these kind of things. And grievance, politics of grievance, which again has a commonality we know with fascism, but it also has commonality with I would dare say it, the essence of the Soviet or Russian mindset. So in the US particularly, are we seeing a kind of divided Soviet states of America emerging, where grievance rather than hope, issues and problems and division rather than solutions are becoming an overwhelming narrative? And indeed, you have Trump, who is very adept at using those modes of thinking to gather resources, gather control around him.
Well, I think that's very much what's happening. Although I would characterize it, I guess, or frame it, is a word I've been using recently, a little differently. What we attribute to the communist mentality, I think really communism is an organic evolution out of the cultural perspective that you described, or that I've been trying to describe, which is that of a peasant, pre-industrial hierarchical society where individuals have no agency. Um, and life is a zero-sum game. So if I can't rise up, so I have to bring my opponent down, otherwise I'll be destroyed. I think that's what's happening now in the West. Why? Because we have seen since 1980, uh, from 1980, with the election of Reagan and Thatcher, a shift in the post-world socioeconomic order. And from 1945 until 1980, in the West, there was a redistribution of income to some extent. Now, the rich remained very rich, and the poor far more numerous than the rich, of course. But there had been a redistribution, and for the first time in almost first time in history, there had been a significant redistribution, so that you had true increase in living standards and agency of the little man in society. Now, this came from the cataclysm of the war and from redistributive policies that emerged from the Depression and from the war. However, that all changed with the triumphs of the neoconservatives, or whatever we wish to call them, as embodied by Thatcher and Reagan. And I'm not. This is not. Well, you do get to a value assessment, but it's an objective data um, exposition, not an attack on a political level. The concentration of wealth started to reverse from 1980, and the rich came to have more and the poor came to have less, so that now you have, I think the figure is some shocking thing like 90% of all the wealth in the United States is held by 1% of the population, or maybe it's the top 10%, and the bottom 80% of the population holds 10% of the wealth. The concentration of wealth is greater than that of the Gilded Age of the, say, 1900, or of the Roman Empire. Uh, so that makes people a little upset when their living standards are being threatened. Now, the standard of living has slowly improved per capita income in the United States or in the West, but it has largely coincided with the increase in two-income families as females have entered the workforce, which I'm happy to say, affirm, I think is a wonderful thing. I want any individual to do whatever he, she, or whomever wishes, but it now takes two incomes to have the same standard of living, broadly speaking, that it took one income to provide 60 years ago when I was a boy. At the same time, you have globalization, another thing that I am a champion of, and free trade, where you do have um, people over the horizon making decisions about your life that you can do nothing about. So at least from the US, one of the stereotypical stories about why Brexit succeeded was because the English didn't want to drink demi-liter. They wanted to drink a pint. And God damn it, no one in Brussels is going to tell me how much beer I can drink. Well, I'm afraid so, or my house should be painted by an Englishman instead of some sort of Pole. That's it. That's it. And in America, you have now um, Beijing or Brussels or who knows making decisions that have affected me at the same time that the middle class, the lower middle class, really the working class that could afford a home and a car and take the family to the movies on the weekend, uh, can't really do that now. And then the deepest phenomenon, of course, is that if people don't look like you, they aren't you. And America was 89% white when I was born, and today it's probably 52% white. And in the next, I don't know, year, 7 years, something, who knows, it will be a majority minority society. One can, this provides all sorts of wonderful things culturally, if one is open to them. But if one has lost one's job at the factory, can't understand what the people making the decisions are saying, and they look different from you, then the other is to blame. And so you then have the rise of the populist right. And this is why the same phenomenon is occurring in France and Holland and Germany and Italy and Great Britain and the United States, because of the loss of relative living standards, the concentration of wealth, the loss of agency in economic and social terms, and the loss of status as the defining cultural and racial element of a given society. So you have packies running around in England, and you have people who don't speak English in America, and everyone gets angry about that. And that plays into the exact narrative of this traditionalist phenomenon, which is the Russian reaction to Western incursions, and why the KGB operations in the West can have such resonance.
And of course, the classic line is, I'm not a racist, but dot, dot, dot. Um, In the US, though, it seems to also be combined with a fairly concerted plan. Now, the idea of a strategic concerted plan coming from Trump, I think, is there's a bit of dissonance there, but he certainly seems to be surrounded by people who do have a plan, and that plan unfortunately seems very much aligned with a degradation of governance, degradation of
Absolutely.
institutions, co-opting of their effectiveness, their impartiality, in fact, a total destruction of that. And of course, we know from history that these tendencies usually go hand in hand with not just diminishing democracy, but actually a comprehensive dismantling of democracy. And usually, to consolidate that power, it involves starting wars as well.
Well, no, Trump doesn't have a coherent philosophy himself. He doesn't care about these things at all. He was pro-abortion until he decided it was politically useful for him to be anti-abortion. So that doesn't matter. He is, in that sense, a weather vane, but quite attuned to what will help him collect and maintain power and influence. However, there are very coherent thinkers doing precisely what you said in an organized, intentional, and well thought, pardon me, well thought out way. So let's see, this is 2025, 21 or 2 years ago. Um, I first became, well, no. I have to go back much further, much further. When I was a college student, I majored in government, which meant I read political philosophy, I think one would say in the English context, and or political science, whatever one says. So one of my classmates, and I knew him, but we were not good friends. I don't know that he would remember me from then, probably not. Was a fellow named Grover Norquist. We literally were classmates in the government department as undergraduates at Harvard in the 1970s. And he was a pleasant fellow and not taken very seriously. Harvard tended, 4 out of 5 Harvard students vote Democratic, 1 out of 5 vote Republican. So he was a Republican, so he was an outlier, which is fine. So was my roommate. Um, but he had then explicitly, he was open about this. He was a libertarian and a small government conservative, fine. He thought that the government was bloated and shouldn't be telling people how to live in almost any way. And so he set as his goal, he said, government, the American government, which means the federal government, well, actually, all levels of government, should be 50% smaller, one half the size that it was then or it is today, and only had two legitimate functions, only two. One was national defense, which meant the military, and two was border security. This is not ex post facto projecting backward. These were the explicit objectives and philosophy of my classmate, Grover Norquist. So, what happened in our lives? I went on to become a classic civil servant, serving the state, an internationalist, a realist, and I think, and a moderate and in domestic policy. Fine. He went on to become involved in Republican politics and had every Wednesday. I think the name of the meeting was the Wednesday morning group uh, of a small number of prominent Republicans in Washington who would meet Wednesday mornings to discuss how we can succeed, have the Republicans succeed electorally and politically and in policy terms, and what are our objectives. And they are to reduce the size of government by 50% so that it only has two functions. Jump ahead now to our time in the election of Donald Trump. Now, who are the ideological, philosophical, coherent strategists and thinkers of the Republican Party and of the Trump administration? It's the authors from in the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, particularly Heritage, of this project we all have heard of, Project 2025. And what is the objective of Project 2025? It is to reduce the size of the government. They will start at 25%. But the objective is 50%. And the objective is that government has only two functions. And what are they? To have a strong military and border security. Now you add on to that, so it's a very coherent policy. Now I became aware of this in policy terms. I always thought that Grover was, we thought he was a gadfly and sort of laughable. The joke is on us. Early in the war on terror, when I started to become involved in the enhanced interrogation program, and the justification of the neoconservatives was the unitary theory of executive power. That's the third pillar. That's actually the philosophical and policy pillar of the Project 2025. What is the unitary theory of executive power, or the theory of unitary executive power? The belief is that the American system of government is inefficient and inappropriately designed for a great power, and for America to implement and succeed in its policies internationally, or for that matter, domestically, but certainly internationally. But that's a coherent argument, and it's probably true. The American system is designed by intent to be inefficient. The intention being that a balance of powers, a separation of powers is better than a concentration of power, because that's the way to avoid tyranny, or the tyranny of the majority. It's the ultimate anti-fascist philosophy. And it has succeeded to the point where the government in America frequently are paralyzed and incoherent. That is true. So their view, the unitary theory of executive power people, is that that's just not acceptable. We have to bring all executive authority into the White House, into the executive control, so that we can have effective policies. Well, that's a legitimate position to have, but it is also, in the American context, literally revolutionary. So maybe we should have a revolution. Maybe we should change all these things. But if you change them, it's either a revolution or it's a putsch, legally or illegally. That's by definition what those changes would be: an utter change in the American system of government. And so what is the Project 2025 doing? Exactly what I said. Now, in the war of terror, to justify unitary theory, I forgot, to justify unitary theory of executive power, I read, they say, well, as their reference, the thinker that the Republicans would cite then to justify enhanced interrogation and the gathering together of power in the executive branch was the prominent thinker named Carl Schmitt, who said blah 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 and blah blah blah. You think, well, okay, well, who's Carl Schmitt? Carl Schmitt was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer, who was the lawyer that justified, quote, legally, unquote, Kristallnacht and the putsch of the Nazi power, Nazi party, to assume power. Why did they do that? Because the state, by definition, was a deep state, which is hostile to the desires and the needs and the well-being of the masses. And the only way that the masses can find redress and to be represented is from, quote, the leader, one man, as opposed to the state, against the state, bypassing and subverting it, assuming all power for himself. So you have this marriage of Carl Schmitt's fascist views, the traditionalist views, which are identical, uh, with their sociological views, with the explicit political objectives of my classmate, who's one of the major figures, totally unknown, relatively speaking, in recent American history, Grover Norquist, whose intent is to eliminate all functions of the government except for two. And that's why we're living the moment we're living.
And of course, you can have some micro decisions that are perhaps more efficient. But I think the history of Russia tells us that on a macro level, on a generational level, it doesn't work, because if you have an authoritarian or even an absolutist, they will undo a lot of what their predecessor did. They might do a complete 360. They will also make decisions and force the population to invest in projects which are completely delusional. So you might be efficient at implementing that project. Well, actually, the Soviet state rarely was efficient, but that's beside the point. It's the actual decisions themselves, the decision-making process, and the investment of your effort in certain activities, whether it be war or the Bildermore Canal or whatever it is, are fundamentally they're inefficient decisions on a macro scale.
Yeah, yes, I agree with everything you said. It's other than to sigh in dismay. I guess that's not an effective response, really, either here on the podcast or in life. But these are very coherent rationales and forces, and powerful. And I think we get to another phenomenon that makes it very hard to contest them, and it's something I touched upon a little bit a short while ago, and it is with regard to the KGB and the Russians, but also with any society. People believe their leaders, and the truth becomes what your tribe says it is. And so you have half of America, or 40%, who almost all of whom are admirable people. They're normal people who wish the well for their families, and not to be unfair to anybody, who uh, reflexively and sincerely accept the framing of their leaders, which really in this instance means Donald Trump, that the solutions to our multiple social, political, economic challenges is to break all to China. This was, I don't know if that was a good choice of term, um, and to demonize your opponent.
And just the last
How
one,
one gets out of
yeah.
this, I think, only by changing the narrative from on top.
And the last bit, just to sort of wrap this up, is it fair then to say that if we apply the sort of the mainstream media methodology, which is to normalize and downplay the problem, and if we try to treat Trump through the lens of normal political process, we're missing the point and potentially putting ourselves at risk because what we need to do is to treat him essentially as a person that is united with an idea and let's say, a cabal of people who really want to bring about a revolutionary coup. In fact, are bringing about a revolutionary coup.
They are. My dismay, though, is that for the long time, I suppose, like most everybody else, thought, well, okay, if we can lay the facts out, then people will understand that Hillary Clinton is not running a pedophile brothel in the basement of a pizza parlor that I used to frequent, actually. That's um, but that's not true. You can lay the facts out, and it doesn't matter. You'll still People will still they'll believe this. And Steven Pinker, the social psychologist, um, I recently read one of his books and he makes a good distinction that, well, day to day, these people actually don't believe that Hillary Clinton is running this pedophile brothel, but it serves their purposes to identify. It's sort of virtue projecting, or there's a term for this. Um, that if you say that that's the case, you can demonize the other side, the other, and affirm your own convictions and belonging in your tribe. And so your little league in the American context, or you know, pub pub friend, maybe in the British context, uh, can be totally normal and buy you a pint and realize that there's no difference between a half liter and a pint. Um, but in this cultural context, they actually believe without acting upon most of the time these cockamamie views, so that facts are irrelevant in the debate.
Mm.
And it seems the only way to change them is that people follow their leaders. And if the leader says the earth is flat, people, a large percentage of people will believe it. And if he says no, it's actually round, then the reality will return. It seems that there's sort of no way past that.
And the opposite can be true in that there may be substantial evidence of criminal doings by your nominated leader. One only need mention Epstein and also the evidence of a certain degree of if collusion's the right word, but between Russia or investment of Russia in his businesses. And there's plenty of
Hmm.
stuff out
Oh
there
yeah.
to create reasonable suspicion. But again, just so you can manufacture a story that's believed, you can cover up a reality And that lie to cover a reality is also unfortunately believed as well.
But my father taught me a lesson which I didn't quite consciously. I remember consciously not wanting to accept. He was involved in local politics for a good part of his life, and he said to me, and I always thought he was a bit. He saw the half empty part of the glass, half of the glass, rather than the half full. And so I tried to resist this and say, "Well, Dad, but it's also half full." And he said, "Glenn, I could stand in front of, at the pulpit of a church and announce, I bring good tidings. Christ has returned. What could be better in a church setting? And I guarantee you that instantaneously half of the congregation will oppose me because I simply made that statement." So that's how it invariably is. Elections will turn always on 2 or 3%, even in the best of circumstances. A landslide is 54 to 46% victory. And he said, so the truth is quite secondary to how people will act.
That is unfortunately where we find ourselves, and with AI and social media, that problem is exponential. That's maybe one for us to tackle in our next conversation. But I'm very grateful to you for coming on again. We had extraordinary comments, fantastic comments, very appreciative against the first one. Let's hope this does just as well, and people find just as much value in it. For today, though, Glenn, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kiev of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kiev of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course, much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kiev of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work, the very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend Operator Starsky says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kiev's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kiev of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kiev of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.